After years in the public eye, former New South Wales Premier Bob Carr is turning his attention to historic buildings. In July, he became the chair of the Australian Heritage Council and last week was appointed as the chair of Museums of History in New South Wales.
That body oversees the Mint, Hyde Park Barracks and the Museum of Sydney, as well as some of Australia's oldest stately homes. Bob Carr joins us now in the studio. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
What do you hope to achieve in these new roles? What's your sort of vision for these great, grand, historic buildings?
I think we need to guide Australians through the view that history is a single story. Because if we do that, we sign up to what John Howard famously called the black armband view, or a view that white settlers were the final word on Australia's character and establishments. The thing I emphasise as we face the interpretation and the curating of our historic building stock is that Australian history is many stories. And they're very often very persuasive and very valid, and they exist side by side with one another, and they can jostle one another, they can compete with one another. If you take that view, you don't kid yourself that buildings established in the convict era are the final word in what Australians were at that time. It was much more diverse than is suggested by Vaucluse House on Sydney Harbour or Elizabeth Farm, the base of the MacArthur family.
So how do you think we balance the recognition of these buildings and treasure the history of them without sort of glossing over some of the darker elements of the past?
Well, I think that's a continuing challenge. In America, throughout the American South, they've pulled down statues of leaders of the Confederacy because they were all associated with a rebellion against the central government based on the extension, the protection of slavery. That's a strong response. And it was interesting that Republican-dominated governments did it at the request of African Americans. In Australia, I think we face an opportunity, not having been a slave society or not a slave society on that scale and in that character, to see that our historic homes from that era tell the story of how the white settlers, with all their achievements in establishing new industries like merino wool and mining, also had interaction with farm labourers, with convicts and with Indigenous Australians, some of them living nearby and looking at new activities and new ownership on land they once assumed to be theirs forever.
So how are you looking to practically bring those different stories together in these buildings? How will you do that?
Well, one approach is to see that youngsters visiting them and forming views of grassroots level Australian history, how people lived, what their bathroom arrangements were like, what a kitchen garden was, how the whole household sustained itself. We'll also learn about the interaction with local Indigenous people. And there are programs at both Vaucluse House and Elizabeth Farm, I understand, that introduce youngsters to those sorts of considerations. We can't leave school-age students forming views about Australian history with the view that the typical Australian, most Australians lived as the colonial elite lived. But I don't favour the force-feeding of a politically correct narrative. The view I take is that Australian history comprises many stories, not a single sanitised narrative, and we ought to be pointing in other directions when we exalt or condemn one part of it. It's not the full story. The full story is a multiplicity of stories.
You talked about the pulling down of statues over in the United States. So are you looking at how other countries are navigating this, and how are you sort of taking on what other countries are doing on what to do and what not to do?
Well, it's a constant argument. When I was in Vienna recently, I saw a statue to their famous mayor of the early 20th century, Karl Lueger. He was a dominant figure. He was a populist. He ran Vienna. He did great things in public works. But he was also a real red-blooded anti-Semite. And on the statue in the square where he had been commemorated for many years, there's graffiti all over the statue. That's not a bad thing. As people are challenged to rethink their history, and things you would gloss over in earlier times, you've really got to confront. It might be that having a plaque, in having written material, explaining the figure in the context of their time and saying that some of the things they stood for are totally unacceptable now is the way of curating it. The American view of pulling down statues of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, eliminating them entirely, is a bolder statement, but one, I think, justified by the nature of chattel slavery in American history.
When you assume new roles, sometimes it can be hard when you're bringing in an agenda of change. What's the reception been like to your...
Well, I think these changes, these approaches are already dealt with. That program I mentioned at Vaucluse House, seeing that youngsters looking at how the colonial aristocracy lived, are also told that there were Indigenous people who lived in the neighbourhood and there was interaction. I remember when I was Premier going to a school in Western Sydney, it was in Penrith, and we looked out at the Blue Mountains, and I said to a group of students, primary school, that's the point. I said something about Blackstone, Lawson and Wentworth, but I said they weren't the first people to cross the Blue Mountains. And quick as a flash, the boy school captain said, yes, they were only the first to record it. And I thought, this was 20 years ago, easily, but I thought the fact that a primary school captain had that perception, showed the fact that we were carrying youngsters with us when we acknowledge that the continent's story did not begin in 1788, that it had a 60,000 year history when another people were the custodians of this land.